The purpose of the conference is to bring experts working on various areas of the bioeconomy that include biofuel, biotechnology, and green chemistry to assess the economic impact of the bioeconomy, what type of policies are needed, and where it is going. The main topic of the conference has been biofuel, because biofuels in the United States and globally are subject to large policy debate. So the food versus fuel issue and the impact of biofuel were a main issue of concern.
Okay, I just gave a presentation on what the impact of biofuel policies are on basic food commodity prices, grains and oilseeds. The analysis sort of looks at how biofuel policies created a link between crops and biofuels for the first time ever in late 2006. And for the ensuing 4-year time period, I find that because of this price link, there's the lowest prices that biofuels can go given crude oil prices. That means there's the lowest price that corn and other crops can go, and that over a 4-year time period, 80% of the price increase would have occurred regardless of supply and demand shifts in crop markets. So 80% of the price increase is due to biofuel policies, at least, and that represents about $1 billion a day transfer from crop consumers to crop producers, which is about what the farm subsidy OECD PSE is as well.
I've done a lot of work on land use change and the response of farmers around the world to the very high commodity prices that we've seen over the last 10 years. Those high commodity prices are really unprecedented, and so they really give us good insight into how the agriculture around the world responds to the incentive to produce more. The countries really were choosing whether to expand at the extensive margin or the intensive margin, and most expanded at the intensive margin, which I suggest means that it's less costly to intensify than extensify. The pattern is a common sense pattern. Those countries that don't have very much land available for expansion intensified. They did not extensify. Those countries that had quite a bit of land that they could move on to, they had extensive patterns of change. Other countries that have both land available and that are subsistence agriculture or low technology agriculture, low productive agriculture, also expanded at the extensive margin.
The introduction of biofuel impacted the U.S. and also the global economies in several dimensions. The first one that we talked about is the greenhouse gases, and there different measurement appears for different crops, and also for the same crop you get different measurement. But you do get a fluctuation, and you do see why people are a bit disappointed, because there was an expectation that it will have a much bigger impact. We do find that sugar is much more substantial than others, and that is the ugly. But overall, introduction of biofuels, or specifically corn ethanol, resulted in a 23% increase in the price of food commodity. Translating it to food prices, it is something in the order of magnitude of adding 1 to 1.5% to the consumer price of food. In the U.S., abroad, it is higher, because the ratio of food consumed by people in developing countries is substantially higher than what it is in the U.S. We started with the impact on fuel prices. When we look at fuel prices, we do see at the median, out of the literature that we reviewed, the median is around 6 to 7% reduction in the price of gasoline, although you have a whole range of impacts, going from a slightly positive effect on gasoline prices or fuel prices to a substantially more negative impact on gasoline prices. But again, the median is around 6 to 7% impact on gasoline prices.
So the food versus fuel issue and the impact of biofuel were a main issue of concern. Another issue that we addressed was the issue of second generation biofuel. What is the potential? What are the costs? who will benefit and who will lose. And this is the area that was covered by Madhukana.
So first generation biofuels are those that are produced from food crops and from like corn and soybeans, as well as from sugarcane. Sugarcane ethanol is being produced in Brazil, and corn and soybean ethanol is being produced in the US. Second generation biofuels are those that will be produced from cellulosic biomass from different types of crop residues, forest residues, as well as dedicated energy crops like miscanthus and switchgrass, or short rotation woody crops like poplar and willow. So there's a wide range of options available for cellulosic biofuels. And while there's been a lot of uncertainty about our potential to commercially produce second generation biofuels, but in the last 6 months or so, since September, October of 2014, two major refineries, large-scale refineries, have emerged and have started production in the U.S. Abengoa in Kansas and Poet in Iowa, and there are two refineries, I believe, in Brazil that have started production from cellulosic feedstocks. And so it seems that the technology is becoming commercially viable. There are others that are there in the pipeline and likely to start production in the near future. But a lot will depend on what happens with policies, particularly the renewable fuel standard in the coming years, as well as oil prices, which will drive the economic viability of these refineries.
About 10% of the gasoline used in American cars is now coming from corn-based ethanol. So in that sense, we've displaced 10% of the gasoline, much of which was imported. The existing mandate calls for that to double. So our work looks at the availability of the feedstocks that will be used to meet the cellulosic ethanol mandate, 15 billion gallon mandate required by law. The kind of feedstocks we're looking at are corn stover, wheat straw, and perennial grasses. The early work that had been done on the subject suggests that there were vast quantities of product available, and that's true. But the experience we have from 2 years of trying to actually get that product into the plant is that only about a fifth of it becomes commercially available. Right now the prices are low and participation is low. But in the work we did, just playing with the geometry of a circle, it's not in the plant's best incentive to increase the price they offer. They'd rather drive a little bit further and get more of those locked-in supplies. And in our case, the locked-in supply were people who grew continuous corn who were anxious to get rid of the surplus product. About 20% of people will do that, and they're more than happy to participate.
Cover crops permit you to harvest a greater fraction of corn residue than you could otherwise, and by that I mean sustainably. Our research suggests that you cannot remove more than 1/3 of the corn residue if you don't have a cover crop and do it sustainably. That is, keep the soil organic carbon high, keep the soil erosion low. So if you want to harvest a half or 3/4 of the residue, you need a cover crop in order to make it sustainable.
A third area of interest is biofuel and forestry. One thing that we learned is that forest product can be both feedstock for ethanol, but they can also produce feedstocks that can be used directly for energy production. And they produce such feedstock already and use them in the US and Europe.
Well, the interesting thing is basically when the most of the profit that drives investment in forestry is you're really trying to grow building products. You're trying to grow trees that can finally produce lumber and plywood to build buildings. But to do that, in the process of doing that, there's a lot of parts of a round tree that doesn't go into a rectangular piece of wood. And that's really, it's the complementary sustainable supply of what could be used for some type of bioenergy that is always going to go along with the production of basically green building product.
It's a market-driven economy, and I think it's safe to say from the last 50 years of data that the more demand there is for trees on the landscape, the more trees there are on the landscape because the markets respond. So in a way, extra demand does lead to
extra harvests, but it also leads to higher prices, and in the long run, that leads to more forest on the landscape. The controversies would be, what kind of forest do you want on the landscape in the future? So, for example, pellet demand might lead to more forest on the landscape, but a higher proportion of them might be pine plantations, so there might be biodiversity impacts.
Another part of the conference is to understand the future of GMOs, because increased production of GMO will increase the supply of fuel and reduce the pressure that restrict biofuels.
So it's kind of this political struggle, and the groups that are in favor of it have to contend with groups that are against it, and then it depends partially on on the politics of the whole thing and where the governments think they can get more votes or get more political influence or whatever, and so there's this kind of competition over the policies.
So in the European Union we have targets for renewable energy. This includes also targets for biofuel. Now these targets have been met by some member states, not by all member states, with respect to biofuel and bioenergy or renewable energy in general. There are a number of supporting activities for reaching those targets, and as far as I understand those policies, they seem to be quite reasonable. I have a little bit of problems with some policies in some member states, not in all member states, but in some member states we observe a high rate of subsidies for renewable energy technologies, and I'm a little bit concerned about this high subsidies to support technologies that are not yet competitive.
I mean, developing countries, if biofuel become competitive with fossil fuels, and I can say biofuel can make a good contribution in the developing country, especially in countries where they are importing entire petroleum products. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, some countries in South Asia, these are the countries, so they are importing entire petroleum product to meet their own demand. There's a kind of energy security issue.
I think you need to have biofuels policies now because the biofuels have already been introduced into the policy mix. If you don't have a policy, then something will happen. I think the policy should be not to expand biofuels, even if biofuels become competitive with oil because oil prices are so high. I think the harmful effects on food prices should be taken into account. You can't just let food prices rise regardless to satisfy the interests of farmers.
Well, I think that there's some major problems with expanding the biofuel economy very much. Right now, it's very difficult to find gasoline pumps that have more than 10% ethanol in them. Plus, there's the potential that current cars wouldn't allow that, so it limits the expansion of the biofuel economy, as does some logistical concerns with moving the volume of materials you need for biofuels. I think there's some real possibilities if we can find drop-in biofuels, that is, other forms other than ethanol, that are compatible with our current infrastructure. Ethanol, which is the thing we produce in the largest volume, is very corrosive of seals, so you can't send it through pipelines. You can't use it in the same kind of pumps as conventional gasoline.
Right now, California has a firm target for reductions by 2020 under its legislative bill, AB 32. And the main activity going on right now has to do with the next round of goals, which will extend beyond 2020 to initially 2030, with an eye towards massive reductions by the year 2050. And I think a lot of the discussions are exactly what pathway to take to these 2030 goals, because some of them may be easier to achieve, but not necessarily be consistent with a pathway that takes you to the eventual 2050 goals. And I think the discussion should also be thinking about what California's activities will do to carbon policy outside of California. And I fear that not enough focus has been paid to that kind of spillover aspect of the policy discussions to date.
I mean, there's really two reasons to be talking about bioenergy, and one is energy security, and the other is climate. And if you didn't care about those two things, you probably wouldn't care about bioenergy that much, unless for some reason fossil fuel prices rose so high that we'd be looking for all these alternatives. So in those contexts, that's what's exciting, is that how do you begin to put together all these pieces? This is a big year in terms of climate policy, because there's international negotiations at the end of the year in Paris, and there'll be new proposals put on the table for commitments by individual countries, and then some perspective on what the combined set of pledges will achieve in terms of climate in the long run. And then we'll be back into a very, very important discussion for this community and more broadly about sort of, how do we get there? What's the implementation? And that's not just a technology question, but it's policy design and institutions and instrument choice and things like that. So we'll be this. That's what's exciting to me, is that all of a sudden we're going to have specific proposals on the table for country-specific climate strategies. Some of them potentially in some coordinated fashion, and then we'll be left with all the hard questions of how do you actually achieve those things.